Welcome to the Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast about nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Okay, welcome back to the podcast, episode 46, Composition Part 3. So there wasn't a whole lot going on in the news this week, so we're not going to have an in the news segment. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get right into the episode this week and talk about composition. Okay, so if you look in the show notes, you'll find a link that will take you out to the Composition Foreground Interest album. So let's talk about foreground interest. Foreground interest often is called near far and depth in your image, adding depth. How this is accomplished is, well, let's just kind of give a brief definition. Foreground interest is the idea that we can place complementary subjects in the foreground that lead the eye into the scene. It usually involves leading the eye to the main subject. So if we go out here to this Flickr page, I'm going to try to explain things and hopefully make more sense. The first image that you see is an image we used previously, and it's called Moravian Falls. This is actually Moravian Falls in North Carolina. But what you're seeing here is a very typical, what they call near-far scenario. If you look in the foreground, we have a series of rocks. And these rocks, I specifically framed this way in the bottom so that they lead our eye into the scene. So you have this near element, something close to you. The far element is actually the falls way in the background. The falls are actually supposed to be the subject of this scene, but I've actually de-emphasized the falls. And instead of making it in the foreground, it's now in the background. So this concept is something that just works. I don't understand the full concepts here. There is the idea of leading lines as well, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But you certainly get the impression that you're being drawn into the scene. So that is a typical scenario that you'll run into when you're photographing landscapes, specifically waterfalls. So I shot this with my Canon 1D Mark II. It's an f/22, 29 millimeters, 15 seconds. At ISO 200. So the next image, again, it's a photograph of a waterfall, or actually, it's a cascade in this photograph. The waterfall is way back in the back, and that is that's a signature image for me. A lot of people do it. It's not just me, but it is one of my signatures. Is the near far concept. And here again, I've positioned rocks on the left side of the screen in the foreground to draw your eye into the scene, and it also provides depth. So your photographs tend to have more of a 3D look instead of a flat 2D look. And it's drawing your eye back to that first cascade, and then you're kind of bouncing around and coming back to the foreground again, and you're kind of going in this loop. And it keeps the viewer interested in your photography, interested in this photograph. And that's what we're trying to do as photographers, is keep people interested in our picture long enough to look at it for more than 2 or 3 seconds. If you can get somebody to look at your photograph for 10, 15 seconds, you're doing pretty good in this day and age. This was shot with my Canon EOS 7D, my EFS 10 to 18 millimeter lens at f/16, 10 millimeters, 1/4 second at ISO 160. Okay, the next image. Now, in this image, we have the John Oliver cabin, which is located in the Great Smoky Mountains in Cades Cove. And when you look at this photograph, the subject is certainly the cabin, but I have positioned intentionally the fence in the foreground, which, if you follow that fence, it leads you down around the right side of the image, all the way down around, and ends at the John Oliver cabin. This is another way to bring attention to your subject without placing your subject directly in the middle of your image or directly in your foreground. I think it adds to the image. I think it actually makes this image more powerful. The fact it's in black and white is also an interesting take, but it's, not exactly, what makes the image. So again, this near-far concept, I've actually given this image a lot of dimension. I've given it 3 dimensions instead of 2. I'm leading the eye into it through this fence. I mean, that is, again, what we're trying to do. Again, trying to keep that image, keeping the viewer engaged in the image. It's a powerful composition technique. It's very easy to learn. It's very easy to master. Start looking for things like this in the foreground. So, I mean, that's pretty much the near-far concept. And like I said, you can take it to any level you want to, but I really do strongly encourage you to start using it, because if you're not using it, you're missing out on a tremendous compositional, not rule per se, but a compositional element. Okay, moving on. The next type of composition is framing. And you're like, well, let me see here. What do you mean by framing? I mean, you're talking about I'm framing my photograph, right? Well, when I say framing, what I really mean is a frame within the frame. So if you're photographing, let's say, a doorway, inside of your frame that you're in your viewfinder, you have a picture of a doorway, and inside the doorway is maybe a priest or something like that. Maybe it's in an old church. That is the idea of framing. It's the idea of putting some kind of container around the subject by using the overall compositional elements. We don't do it much in wildlife photography, but you do see a lot in architecture. Some wildlife, you do see it in some scenics as well, but particularly architecture, you'll find this, and portraiture. So let's go back out to Flickr site, go to albums, and click on framing. Okay, the first image here is an image called White-Throated Sparrow. And in this image, I actually have a rare opportunity to frame my subject, my wildlife subject. To the left of the image, you'll see this elbow, this bent branch, or actually bent trunk of a tree. And what that does is it really gives us a framing element. It really allows us to frame this sparrow. And you can see that the sparrow is not very large in the frame. But because I've added this framing element, you don't really seem to mind it as much. It seems that it adds to the image. It's the idea of adding to the image, not taking away. You start with something simple like this white-throated sparrow, and you add this framing element, and now you've totally changed the image. You've totally changed the dynamics of this image. It could be other things in your photograph. It could be a mountain in the background that's framing a bear. I mean, I don't know. There's any number of scenarios that are possible with the framing techniques. Let's go to the next image. The next image is of an eastern screech owl. And I'm a big fan of eastern screech owls. I love them. I love any screech owls, actually. They're just a cute little bird. They make some very interesting sounds. Just as an aside, I went camping with my son last weekend. And as I laid there about 10 o'clock at night, I heard that familiar trilling sound. And I knew right away it was a screech owl. And I stayed awake and listened to it for quite a while. And they were calling back and forth, probably a mating pair. What a great experience to have with your kids. If you don't camp or haven't ever camped with your kids or even had a camping experience, I highly recommend that you go do it. It's definitely something worth doing. Even if you only do it once in your life, it's still something worth trying. Anyway, I digress. This picture of an eastern screech owl is intentionally framed. The screech owl is perched inside this opening of this tree trunk, and it just frames that bird perfectly. And it gives us a real sense of habitat, not to mention isolation of the subject. We're going to get into that more in a minute. It's it's a good image. The fact that he's yawning helps tremendously. But again, an example of how you could use framing in wildlife photography. A great compositional element. The sky's the limit here, really, folks. I mean, you can do whatever your heart desires. I mean, you can do setup shots where you intentionally are doing framing by using various perches and so forth. You can look for this type of thing in the wild. Because in the end, that's what separates, I think, a good or a great photographer from a mediocre or average photographer is looking for situations like this that happen naturally, or even set up by you. And that's where the creativity comes in. That's where wildlife photography and nature photography ceases to be a left-brained attempt at documentary shots and becomes more right-brained and more creative. Okay, so let's move on to the next compositional elements. The next compositional element is leading lines. And I talked about this just a minute ago. Simply defined, the idea of guiding the user into your image through the use of physical, or in some cases virtual lines. The lines usually end up pointing to the main subject. Leading lines. Let's go out there to Flickr and let's take a look at the Leading Lines album. Okay, the first image here. We've looked at this before, but I thought it was such a great example of leading lines that we should take a look at it again. This is my shot of the pine forest. We used this also when we talked about symmetry. This is a very symmetrical or close to symmetrical image. But it also has strong leading lines. What do I mean by that? If you look at the rows of trees on the right of the path and the row of tree on the left of the path, they form converging lines going into the distance. And although it doesn't point to a subject necessarily, it draws our eyes in to the trees, those trees dead center in the background. And it really helps to define the path that's going down here in the middle. Again, a very powerful technique that is associated often with near-far, and we're going to get into that in just a second. Gives the photograph more depth, gives it more interest. Just again, another solid compositional technique. This image was shot with my Canon EOS 1D Mark II, my 22 to 55 millimeter lens, f/16, 35 millimeters, 1 second at ISO 100. Okay, next image. Again, we're going to look at the John Oliver cabin we just looked at, because this is a perfect example of leading lines. The cabin itself is in the upper left third. Again, this is also a rule of thirds image. So the cabin is placed in the upper left third. The fence starts in the bottom right third and moves around through the image, curls all the way in to the cabin itself, and that forms a line, a leading line that curves back in toward the main subject. Again, a powerful technique. So you see, even so, where some of these images overlap, where if you're using a near-far kind of scenario, composition scenario, oftentimes there's a leading line, either an obvious line like a roadway or something, or in this case, more of a virtual line that kind of hugs the fence. So again, another great compositional element. Let's move on. This is going to be kind of a quick episode. I'm actually finishing up the compositional study today. There are other things that we can learn, but this is going to be the end of this series. So, okay, the last compositional element we're going to talk about is subject isolation. And I want to spend some time on this because this is a passion of mine. This is another signature of my images. Subject isolation results in impact. Simply defined, it's the idea of composing the image in such a way that the subject is the predominant element in the scene. So we are isolating our image. We are providing impact to the end user or the viewer. This is my calling card. When I am photographing almost any species, I am a very in-your-face photographer. I am an eyeballs photographer. You know, Moose Peterson, he's not an eyeballs photographer. I am. I'm in your face. I want to see the details in the feathers. I want to see the eyes. I want to see the pupils. I want to see the feathers and the facial disc of the owl. All of this. It provides so much impact. It provides a view of a world that we simply don't see as human beings. You know, how often do you see, you know, when I look out this window, my window here in my office, when I look out over the backyard, I see a bunch of small birds. My eyes cannot zoom in. I see a bunch of birds that look like dark shadows. Now, I've come to know what they look like just because of the way they fly and the way they are shaped and so on. But to the average human, they just look like a brown blob or a black blob. And part of my passion for photography is bringing that world to everyone, a close view of that world. As a matter of fact, I am probably going to be getting more and more into macro photography in the coming years because I really am passionate about that impact, that close view, that subject isolation. Okay, so again, clicking in your show notes on the link that takes you out to the album called Composition, Isolation / Impact. Okay, the first image, we also looked at this a week or so ago. This image is, without a doubt, probably my favorite image, without a doubt. And the reason is it has total subject isolation and impact. Again, just as I said before, I've intentionally cropped in camera. This was not cropped in post. This was done in camera. I intentionally cropped the bear's ears out. I left his forehead, his nose, part of his paw, and his very intense eyes. That's impact, folks. That's what subject isolation does for you. It brings that world right in your face. Do I like environmental shots as well? Yes, absolutely. But this is my calling card, if you will. This was shot with my Canon EOS 7D 150-600 Sigma, f6.3, 600 millimeters, 1/100th of a second, ISO 1600. And another takeaway from this image, you'll notice my ISO is 1600. That's pretty high for a 7D. And I don't even notice it. Why don't I notice it? Because the image is powerful. And I know this is a powerful image, not just because I like it, but many, many others have told me in person, at art shows, they've told me how powerful this image is. And so my point is to you that if you do more of this, if you isolate, you will start to become a better photographer. I truly believe that. With wildlife photography particularly, you will become a better photographer. With macro photography, you will become a better photographer. Okay, the next image. Again, image of a polar bear taken at a zoo. Total isolation. You can see the background is black. He's a white bear on a black background. Total isolation. The bear has a great facial expression. He's doing some kind of vocalization there. He actually was not yawning. This was actually some kind of vocalization he was doing, or she. I love it. I love it. It's an intense image, intense portrait. Again, taken with my Canon EOS 7D, the Sigma 150-600, f5.6, 347 millimeters, 1/1000th of a second at ISO 400. Incidentally, a good shot is a good shot is a good shot. Whether you take it at the zoo or whether you take it in the wild, a good shot is a good shot. Now, is it more rewarding to take a photograph in the wild? Yeah, absolutely. In the end, the user or the viewer may or may not care about whether you took it at the zoo or not. They may not care that you laid for 3 days in the snow and got frostbite on your big toe. They may not care about all that stuff. They just want to see a pretty picture. And so, yeah, you and I care about that type of thing. But remember, the viewer, who is our target audience, doesn't necessarily care. So by all means, if you're never going to make it to Alaska, go to the zoo. If you're never going to be able to photograph a black bear in the wild, go to the zoo. Go to rehab centers, go to nature preserves, whatever you have to do to get the shot. Make it happen. Okay, the next image. Again, total isolation on this barred owl. The background is barely even visible. It's such a tight shot. It's very similar to the black bear. It's such a tight shot and sharp. And I love the way it's a 3/4 view on the owl's face. I love the detail in the facial discs. A shot that you don't normally get to see of a barred owl. I mean, so close that the eye is like the prominent feature. What an in-your-face kind of image. It makes you feel like you're just right there. And that's, again, what I'm going for with this impact and isolation. This was a barred owl, as I said. It was shot with my Canon 1D Mark III, 150-600 Sigma, f6.3, 516 millimeters, 1/400th of a second at ISO 500. Okay, the next image. Again, I'm just hitting you over the head with this thing. Can't stress it enough. Again, a symmetrical image, and then on top of that, it also has complete impact. Complete in-your-face photography. Here we've got a Eurasian eagle owl. We've got his head composed of mostly the entire frame. We've got a very simplified background. Accents his coloring perfectly. Such shallow depth of field here, actually. I am so close to this bird that the depth of field is literally millimeters. I mean, it's probably 2 to 3 millimeters. Maybe a little more than that, maybe 4. I don't know. But it's very, very, very shallow. That's kind of what it takes sometimes to get shots like this. This was a shot taken at Photo Wild. Again, a place where you can get great isolation. And I think that's one of the reasons that I like going to rehab centers and so forth, because it allows me to really exercise my creativity on the isolation aspect. And that's a big part of my photography. So this was shot with my Canon EOS 1D Mark III, my Sigma 150-600 Contemporary, f6.3, 600 millimeters, 1/200th of a second at ISO 800. Well, folks, that's about all there is to composition. That'll give you, there's a lot more, but that will give you a very good head start. There's a lot of great books out there on it. There's a lot of great videos on it, a lot of great articles on it. So get out there, check it out. You will not be disappointed. I also want to say a big shout out to everybody that's been listening. Thanks for listening. You're really helping this podcast continue, because if it wasn't for you, I would have no reason to even do this stuff. And if I can help you at all, then that's an awesome thing. So again, totally respect you. Thank you. I guess that's really all I had. So thanks for listening. Make it a great day and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.